Hello, I'm Jemima.
Hello, I'm Barry.
Thank you for coming today.
Not at all. You've asked to find out about the Korean War, and I served there in 1952 to 1953.
So, when and where were you born, and can you tell me something about your early life?
I was born in Loughborough in Leicestershire in 1932, and I was one of the children of a pair of general practitioners, so both my parents were doctors. Unfortunately, my father died in 1940, and I was sent away to school, ostensibly to get away from the bombing during the Second World War. But I went to a school in North Wales, and my recollection is on the first week at school, we lay out on the cricket field watching the sky to see a dogfight between Spitfire fighters and the bombers that had been attacking Liverpool. So it wasn't really a very peaceful area. 5 years later, I moved to Cranley in Surrey, and I stayed there for 6 years and read French, history, English language, and was ready to go to university, but we had to do 18 months national service at that time, and in my last year at school, they extended the period to 2 years. So I went into the army at the age of 19.
Why did you choose the army?
Was fairly easy. You had to have perfect vision to join the Navy. Anybody who joined the Air Force would stay as an other rank for the whole of their service. They would not be commissioned. And so the Army seemed an interesting place to go. And I had a relative who served in the artillery, so I asked to go in the Royal Artillery, and sure enough, on the 23rd of August 1951, I became gunner Tuncliffe in the Royal Artillery. The training was at Oswestry, and for 12 weeks we did really basic drill, simple map reading, shooting with rifles, and a very small amount of gun drill. After 12 weeks we went to an artillery training regiment where we learnt all about a gun which they call the 25-pounder, which fires a shell that weighs 25 pounds. It has a barrel with a caliber of about 3.5 inches, so it will fire a shell 20,000 yards, 15,000 meters. We trained there for 16 weeks, I think, and during that time, those who were seen to have certain qualities would be sent on War Office Selection Board for possible commissioning as officers. I went on what they call the WOSB, W-O-S-B, and I passed, and I was then sent to the Mons Officer Cadet School at Aldershot, and I was there from November 1951 until March 1952, and during that time we did more square bashing, we did night exercises, we did simple infantry work, and then we intensified our training on the 25-pounder gun. And at the end of the course, we went to South Wales, to the ranges at Sennybridge near to Brecon, and we were firing the guns there. We were duly commissioned, and that was at the beginning of March, big pomp and ceremony service. And after that, I was posted to a regiment waiting for a troopship to take me out to the Far East. I suppose I was there for about 6 weeks, and this time it was not in a 25-pounder regiment, it was in a heavy field regiment which fired guns with a barrel caliber of about 7 inches, or guns with a caliber of 155 millimeters, which is about 6 inches. These would fire shells anything up to 17 or 18 miles. After about 6 weeks there, I was sent on embarkation leave for a fortnight, and then got to Southampton and went aboard the troopship, the Empire Orwell, which sailed from Southampton out to Japan. It stopped at Port Said, Aden, Colombo, Singapore, Hong Kong, Busan. It was spelled with a P then, but they call it Busan with a B now, where I got off, and the ship went on to Kure in Japan. From the port of Busan, we waited for about 12 hours for trucks to take us to the station to go on the train that ran from Busan to Seoul. This is a journey of about 120 miles, and if you made the journey in less than 24 hours, you were lucky, because all the railway bridges had at one time been destroyed, and the rebuilt bridges limited the speed to about 5 miles an hour, and it's very boring travelling at 5 miles an hour for that distance. We got to Seoul, and the city was completely flattened. There were only about 2 buildings taller than a metre tall. Everything else was flattened, mainly because the houses had been of mud, rice straw, etc. They weren't really permanent buildings. The ones that had survived were the modern concrete structures, and they had survived. Also, the ancient city gates of Seoul had somehow survived, and they were being repaired. Everybody else's houses were flattened, but they were repairing the city gates, which went back to about the 14th, 15th century. At the dead of night, we arrived in the divisional area, and I spent one night under canvas at the headquarters of the artillery. The next morning, I was sent to the mortar troop, where I was going to be for about 3 months. And this is a mortar with a barrel diameter, the caliber of 4.2 inches, which fires a 20-pound bomb 4,200 yards maximum. So we were in the front line area, probably just behind the front line of the infantry. So we were really quite close, and the enemy were, 1,000 yards away.
Why were you in Korea?
The United Nations had been established in 1945, and this was the first challenge by the communist part of the world against the free world, as we thought it. And the North Koreans were communists, and the South Koreans were friendly to the West, and they were allies of America in particular. Korea itself had been a free kingdom until about 1910, when Japan had annexed the whole of the peninsula. It had stayed like that until 1945, at the end of the war, when the peninsula was divided into two between the communists and the free world. The north was given to Russia and China as the communist leaders, and the south was part of the free world with America leading. As soon as South Korea was attacked, the United Nations felt duty-bound to do something about it, because otherwise they would have just been seen as men of straw who would have collapsed, rather like the old League of Nations, which had done nothing in most of its time up until the Second World War. So the United Nations called for support. The first response was from the Americans, who had troops in Korea anyway, and the Royal Navy, who had a squadron out in the Far East, and they immediately joined in patrolling the waters around Korea and possibly attacking any targets that they saw along the peninsula coast. The build-up was fairly slow to get the 22 countries involved who supported the South Koreans, and most of the 22 sent troops, but India sent a field ambulance, the Danes sent a hospital ship, and some of the other non-combatants sent medical services or welfare services of some sort. But the response came from England and the old Commonwealth. That meant Australia, Canada, New Zealand. The Thai country, Thailand, sent a brigade and some transport planes. Puerto Rico, Belgium, Holland, all sent contingents, and eventually a force which was really very much unprepared for this tried to hold back the communist advance. Within 6 weeks, the North Koreans had driven south and had formed a box around the port of Pusan, probably about 50 to 100 miles north of Pusan and east of Pusan. There was this front line, and that was the line where we just could not retreat any further, otherwise we'd have been out of the country altogether. Once more forces arrived, then the fight back started, and we drove the communists north. And you may have heard that there was an invasion, an amphibious invasion at the port of Incheon on the west coast, which was very successful because it threatened the whole of the withdrawal of the communists to the north, and so they scuttled like mad to save being totally caught. And the United Nations advanced beyond the 38th parallel, which was the boundary line between North and South Korea. General MacArthur, at this point in command of the United States armies, drove up and was really ready to attack power stations in China, beyond the river Yalu, which was the boundary between North Korea and China. And he was not really going to take any orders from President Truman, and eventually Truman had to sack him. And we suddenly had the United Nations forces being commanded by General Ridgway, and the threat to China was stopped, and even the thought of an atomic war was stopped, because MacArthur was apparently going to stop at nothing. So the battle raged, and we came back south a bit until April 1951, when again you may have heard of a tremendous stand by the glorious Gloucesters on the River Imjin, where the British contingent, which included the Northumberland Fusiliers and a Belgian battalion, they held off a force of Chinese which were maybe 10 times their numbers, so that the United Nations could consolidate and plug the gap in the line. But the entire Gloucester battalion was either lost or taken prisoner. Some managed to escape and get back to lines, but the Battle of the Imjin River really was quite something. We have heard more of that, but across on the Central Front, there was the Battle of Cap Yong, and this involved the Middlesex Regiment, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, the Canadians, whose infantry regiment has the lovely name of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and the 3rd Royal Australian Regiment, were at times completely surrounded individually, and the Americans had taken away their tank support and their artillery support, but they managed to fight their way out quite successfully, and they inflicted so many casualties on the Chinese that the Chinese withdrew and left them to it. But we hardly hear anything about that, because we won, they lost, and we didn't lose very many prisoners or anything. So the Battle of Cap Yong was as serious as the battle on the Imjin, but the Gloucesters took the publicity for sure. We then had a period when Seoul had been taken and retaken again. We were on a line somewhere in the middle of the Korean peninsula going north-south. And then the decision was taken that was going to be a complete army advance to establish a line which we could defend. And so the whole army moved north at considerable risk and loss, I think. And we established a line which was just north of the old 38th parallel. And at about that time, there was discussions about an armistice. And in conditions where you think the war may end, the need to have a monster battle or to lose any casualties unnecessarily becomes a thing of considerable interest. Most of the war from then on were a series of skirmishes which could be very, very serious but would be very limited. The Chinese would try and capture a particular hill. And in that part of Korea, the hills, well, you could say they were small mountains. And if you controlled the top of one mountain, you could control a vast amount of land because you could see everything that was going on. So anyway, there were a number of battles, and you may have heard of Bill Speakman won his Victoria Cross in a battle on Point 355 where he perpetually attacked the Chinese as an individual, and when he ran out of ammunition, he is reputed to have thrown beer cans at them, and he drove them off and somehow lived to tell the tale, and he is still alive today. So we had a few battles of that nature, but then the line stabilized, and from November 51 until July 53, when the war finished, there were very few major battles, with the exception in the area where I was in, which was known as the Commonwealth Divisional Area. The Chinese tried on 3 occasions to take the Hook Ridge, which would have given them an insight into the whole of the rear part of our front line. And this was defended first of all by the Black Watch and then by the Duke of Wellington's regiment. And apparently the weight of artillery fire that fell on the Hook outweighed anything that had been seen in the First World War. And on the morning after the big battles, it was hard to see where the front line had ever been. All the trenches had been blown to pieces, all of the dugouts had been destroyed. It was an absolute moonscape. But the engineers rebuilt the front line, and we then had the second Battle of the Hook, when the Duke of Wellington's fought in May of 53, just before the armistice. I had served from June 52 until the end of June 53, and left the front line and went over to Japan to catch the ship home, and sailed on the 12th of July in another troop ship called the Empire Foy, which again was an ex-German luxury liner of pre-war days, which had been handed to Britain as a war prize after the Second World War.
What did you do in the Korean?
The first posting I had was a troop leader of a mortar troop. The mortar, as I've mentioned, is a 4.2-inch caliber. There were 4 mortars to a troop, 2 troops to a battery. And each mortar troop was dug in to a position, and because Korea was covered in small hills and mountains, we used to be put in behind a fairly large hill, and dug our bunkers into the sides of the hill. And the whole thing was that a mortar tends to fire up in the air and down, so you could go over the top of a hill, whereas a field gun tends to fire like that. So the field guns were much further behind us, and by the time the shell had got to the front line, there was enough room between the shell and the top of the hills. But we would tuck in behind these hills, and during the daytime, we would probably be doing very little. It sounds as though we were terribly idle, but there was maintenance to be done on the guns. There was maintenance to be done keeping your bunkers and gun pits and ammunition stores all secure. And there was the weather. The weather in Korea varies from, and I've got to go to old-fashioned Fahrenheit, so 40 degrees of frost in the winter, which is very cold, it would freeze the ground down about 4 feet. So that was the winter, but in summer it could rise to 120 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 30 something degrees Celsius. So the range of things was enormous, and we suffered from the monsoon rains. And when it rains, it really rains. The effect on the River Imjin, which ran through our divisional area, could be to put the level of the river up by 27 feet overnight. So that was all the water that had fallen on the hills, draining down the Imjin and then past us, and suddenly what had been something you could ford, you could walk across, then became a raging torrent, and it was very difficult to keep bridges up because they could get washed away. So we had, back on our troop site, we had maintenance, we were fighting the weather and the Chinese, and then most of the activity took place at night. Both sides would send out patrols from their front line, not necessarily to have a real fight, but just to see or find out what the other side were doing. But there would often be the requirement for artillery support to try and keep the heads of the Chinese gunners down while people were out on a patrol. So we did a small amount of firing then, but if we had an infantry mounting an attack of maybe 30 or 40 men, then we probably have a huge program of targets to engage. And that was when your knowledge from school certificate in mathematics and trigonometry really came into its own, because you had to work out all the bearings and distances for the targets from just being given a grid reference of the target you had to hit. So I had found great difficulty with trigonometry at school, but suddenly, with the practical need to do it for a purpose, I became quite successful at working out all these things. So you'd be doing a certain amount of mathematics. During the actual firing of the guns, you could either be out supervising the guns themselves, or you could be doing duties in the command post, which was another dugout, where there was the plot where you had what would appear to be a great big blank map on 1 in 25,000 scale, and you would plot on that where your gun position was, and as the various targets came in, you would plot where those targets were, and by a very simple ruler, you could work out what the bearing to that target was and the range, and give the necessary orders to the guns. All the time, you were responsible for the radio communications with your other troop in the battery and the regimental command post, who also sent you targets to fire on or things to do. So you would be working part of the day, but often you would be catnapping during the afternoon in readiness for possibly working all through the night if there was something going on. When there was a really big battle, our instructions were that we were sitting on a stack of 4.2 mortar ammunition which had been manufactured for the Second World War, had been brought out to Korea, and was not really safe to be carted all the way back at the end of the war. So we really felt that the best thing we could do was to fire it all off. And on occasions when you would have thought that 10 rounds would have been adequate, we might have fired 200 or 300 rounds just to get rid of the ammunition. Now, it sounds terrible in these days of shortage of things, but the only thing that would happen, and which I had to do later on, we would have just had to blow up our ammunition stores, because nobody would risk taking the ammunition onto a truck to drive it away. The mortar bomb was not a very safe bomb. The mechanism which prevents it going off bang until the fuse is struck was not as secure on a mortar as on all the other shells in the artillery. So we knew that we were doing a service to get rid of all the ammunition when we could. So the amount of weaponry or bombs that were fired seemed to be out of all proportion to what was going on. And we also had competitions as to which mortar could have the most mortar bombs in the air between the first one going off and landing, which would be about 50 seconds later. How many bombs could you get in the air? And I think the maximum was 38, which if you got it out of sync, you might risk dropping a bomb on something which hadn't left the barrel. So that was something which wasn't really encouraged, but as youngsters, we thought it'd be a good idea to have a record for that. So we would do that. Other than that, we would, every 2 months, the formations within the division would swap around. If we had 2 brigades, that would be 3 battalions, a mortar battery, a field regiment. They would swap over. One might go into reserve, and the chap who was in reserve come out there, and we would be moving from one mortar position to another. Well, when you move mortar positions, you never think that the last guy who was there kept a very neat shop. So you would spend ages cleaning up your new mortar position and seeing that everything was okay. Now, when there was absolutely nothing happening, the opportunity to change the diet of steaks and turkey, which was the American fare that we were very glad to have. Korea is the home of the pheasant. The Romans brought the pheasants to Britain. How they got them from Korea, I don't know, but they came through China. So there'd been no farming on the Korean peninsula for 2 years, because all the civilians were made to stay back 10 miles behind the front line. So there were a lot of old rice paddies which had had rice on them, and no one to harvest it apart from the pheasants. So these pheasants were getting really large, and it did seem a pity not to convert them to the pot. So some, mainly officers, yes, I think it would be all officers, would have their shotguns sent from England, and of an afternoon, maybe 10 or so shotgunners would go out with somebody with a Sten gun, which is a machine gun which fires bullets rather fast, would go with them in case, apart from flushing out a pheasant, you might flush out a Chinese infiltrator. Well, one day we went out shooting, and we came back in pheasant parlance with 52 brace. That's 102 pheasants, a deer, a brown bear, and a fox. And we ate the pheasants and most of the deer, and the Koreans ate the fox and the brown bear. But it did make a difference, and it was really very good fun. Not for the pheasant, but it gave us something to do other than sitting looking at a mortar all day. So that was one way which we could get the rations sorted out. Other than that, we played cricket. It's difficult to look at Lords on a test match or Edgbaston and think that you can play cricket on something which has just had a bulldozer flatten out the bumps and a piece of matting put down so that you could, as a wicket, and you can then play cricket. A matting wicket just after the monsoon is ideal for a left-hand spin bowler, and that's what I happen to be. So my tally of wickets at cricket was really quite something. I'm not going to brag and say how many because I can't remember, but I know it was really quite significant. So we would play cricket. Okay, we weren't in whites, we were still in our khaki slacks and shirt and boots, but we played cricket. Other than that, during the summer you could go swimming in the Imjin. From the spring until the autumn, you could sometimes find a shower or bath unit where the engineers brought up a huge boiler, took water from a river or stream, heated it up, and you could then either have a hot shower or a hot bath. And the old dirty water went back in the river. I'm sorry about conservation and that sort of thing, but it did. So you could go for bath or a shower, which filled in the time. During the winter, the rivers froze, and it was totally impossible for this. And my record was from November 1952 until March 1953, when the temperature was in the sub-zeros. I never had a bath.
Mm.
But of course, nobody could tell, because it was just like living in a deep freeze. And nobody, I'm sorry to say, will smell if they're frozen to that degree. So nobody really worried. And then when the summer came, we all had baths and showers again. Then, after about 3 months in the mortar troop, I was swapped with the regimental intelligence officer. I think he wanted to come out to the mortar troop rather than for me wanting to be intelligent. So I moved from a mortar troop to the regimental command post, where I was responsible for the regimental radio net, which had all the mortar batteries attached, and communications with the headquarters, the Royal Artillery, and on that wireless network were all of the heavy guns of the rest of the corps. That's the bigger organisation than the division. That entailed being on duty from 8 in the morning till 6 at night, and one night in 4 you had time for supper, and you were then on duty from 7 in the evening until 8 the following morning, and you never had time to recapture your lost sleep. So you were working 12-hour, well, virtually a 12-hour day, and one night in 4, and you somehow, I suppose you catnapped during the afternoons again, but you were still meant to be in charge of two wireless networks and a whole lot of men. During the time I was at the headquarters, we did various exercises where we actually moved our headquarters, which was really quite difficult, as they'd been settled there for over a year, and it's like moving house. You find that you've got so many bits and pieces, it doesn't all fit in the lorries. But anyway, somehow we moved, and we moved back again. We used to help out with some of the other units in the area, and we were fortunate that the Indian Field Ambulance had part of their unit opposite to us, and they were very gracious to invite us to Sunday lunch, which meant that we had the most superb curries. And if you like curries, the Indian Field Ambulance curries were the tops. So that would be another way of helping out. We were occasionally sent on training exercises, or training for a day, which was like going back to school. And I think, even though we were only 19 at the time, we thought that was a little bit in for it. You know, it really wasn't us. We knew it all, sort of. And so the time passed. I was asked to fly in one of the little air observation flight planes, which were known as Osters, an engine at the front and wings that sort of flapped, down to Seoul on an urgent mission, which turned out to be collecting 6 crates of lobsters, which were due to be brought back to our regiment, who were giving an official dinner to the retiring British general. So I had the most magnificent trip, flitting past all the mountains going down to Seoul, and then being squashed in the back of the plane with the lobsters taking pride of place in my seat, flying back again. And from there on, I became really quite interested, because we would listen on the headquarters net, wireless net, to them engaging targets from the air observation flight. And that was really quite interesting, particularly when one of them ran out of fuel and had to do a crash landing, and was still giving a commentary on his crash landing right to the moment he hit the deck. Unfortunately, he bounced all right, so he survived. So there were odd things to be done. You could go and... One of the other duties I had was to go around to the various mortar troops that we possessed, to keep them in the picture on what was happening on the front line, if they didn't know about the things that were happening on a different part of the front line to theirs. I also had to inspect their mortar positions, which had been prepared in case we had to withdraw. And one withdrawal line was known as Wyoming, and the second line was known as Kansas. And I could go off with a driver and a few other chaps to check each position, its ammunition supply, how the water, whether there were any streams nearby, again in case we needed water. And that took me all over the country. I had a friend who was in a field regiment who stayed with his troop the whole time and never left the troop area. He didn't know anything at all about the rest of Korea, so I did have an interesting time at that. We were given 5 days leave, which they called rest and recuperation. It was neither rest nor was it recuperation, but anyway, because at 1920, when you go partying away from the front line, you really do go partying. We would have 5 days leave halfway through our year, and then at the end of the year we would be shipped home. The rule was that you were only allowed to stay in Korea for 1 winter. So you could do 12 or 13 months, but you wouldn't do more than 1 winter. I had about 5 days in Japan. I was in Tokyo for a short while. Again, it was a city that was still recovering from the Second World War. I went to some of the seaside areas around Kure, and I also walked through the main dock area in Kure, which had been one of the main shipbuilding places for the Japanese Navy during the Second World War, and had built some of the largest ships then known. At the time, in the graving dock where they'd built one of their huge battleships, there was what was going to be a 250,000-ton tanker, and at that time the largest tanker afloat would probably have been about 50,000 tons. So we looked into the graving dock and we thought, 250,000 tons, it'll never float. And now we have tankers which are 500,000 tons and even bigger. So it was interesting, and after all we were still only 1920. And we were looking forward to coming home because we only had, we never had home leave the whole of the year we were out there.
So what happened after you came home?
Kure in Japan, which is just across the bay from Hiroshima, where the atomic bomb was dropped. I left Kure in July, and we sailed on a slightly different route home. We called at Okinawa, Hong Kong, Singapore, and then we went straight across the ocean to Africa, to Mombasa, the port of Kilindini, where we stayed for 2 days while we dropped off the Black Watch, who were going to take a posting in Kenya. At the time, our relations with Egypt weren't very good, and we were keeping our fingers crossed that we would be refused permission to go through the Suez Canal, and that we would therefore sail all the way around the Cape. Unfortunately, our hopes were dashed, and we set sail from Kilindini through Aden and up to the Suez Canal, where we adopted a position rather like making the ship a frontline area, sandbags out, and those who were meant to be good shots were given the necessary equipment, and everybody else stayed below decks. And I must say, as one of the ones who was given a sniper rifle, I really wish that somebody had tried to do something nasty, because I was dying to have a pot shot at them as the final bit of my trip. But nobody did, and we went through to Port Said without incident. At that point, it was my 21st birthday, and I was helped to celebrate it in a very, very serious way, to the extent that for the next few days I cannot honestly remember what happened, but I know that the ship sailed into Valletta harbour, and I looked out of the porthole of my cabin to see the sandstone blocks on the wall above the quayside, and that's all I can remember. And another 2 days later we were passing through the Straits of Gibraltar, and my friends carried me out of my cabin and leant me over the rail and said, "Barry, that is Gibraltar." And I think I was heading in the right direction then, so I can remember Gibraltar. And then things became a bit clearer. We got up to the north coast of France at Ushant, when the ship ran dry. There was no alcoholic beverages at all, which was a bit of a trouble. So we were living on lemonade and tonic water up the English Channel, and we arrived off Southampton 5 minutes too late, and a very large and important looking liner, I think, it wasn't the Queen Elizabeth or the Queen Mary, but it was something about that size, pinched our berth in Southampton. So for 24 hours or so, we were anchored off Calshot Spit, and as the evening drew on, we watched all the pubs open, and there we were without a drink. And we sat there until the following day, and we eventually docked, got ashore, and were taken by train from the quayside up to London and to the main barracks for the artillery at Woolwich. And after 3 days there, handing over all of our unnecessary equipment, we were then sent on demobilisation leave, and I rejoined my family for the first time in 13, 14 months. And after that, 6 weeks later, I started reading law at Caius College at Cambridge. And 6 weeks after that, I went down with malaria. In spite of taking all of the preventive thingamajigs. And after another fortnight, I'd recovered from that, and fortunately, I've never suffered again from that. But then I carried on at Cambridge for 3 years and graduated eventually, got married, and, well, you know, history goes on.
Thank you for talking to me this morning. It's been really interesting to learn about it.
It's been a pleasure.